Greetings. The first thoroughly described epidemic, the so-called Athenian plague, occurred from 430 to 426 BC during the war between Athens and Sparta, the so-called Peloponnesian War. This war lasted from 431 to 404 BC and ended with the victory of the Peloponnesian League led by Sparta. The circumstances that led these city-states to war are as follows. Athens and Sparta made a significant contribution to repelling Persian aggression during the Greco-Persian Wars, which ended in 449 BC and became the most influential states in ancient Greece. A clash between these states in the struggle for hegemony was inevitable. To a large extent, the contradictions were also due to the different political systems of the states. Athens represented a democracy, while in Sparta, power was in the hands of an oligarchy. In the city-states allied with them, both sides tried to establish a government similar to their own. There were significant differences between these states in the organization of their armed forces. Sparta had the most powerful land army, and engaging it in direct confrontation was suicidal. The army of any Greek city-state, including Athens, would inevitably be defeated in a direct battle. The army, like those of other Greek city-states, consisted of free citizens of the state, essentially farmers who owned their own land, to which were attached the so-called helots, who were slaves, or rather serfs, of the Spartan state. Therefore, Spartan warriors had to return home from their campaigns in time for the harvest. Moreover, leaving the helots, who did not have good feelings towards the Spartans, unsupervised for long was also undesirable. Consequently, Spartan military campaigns were short-term, lasting no more than 3 to 4 weeks. In 430 BC, the campaign lasted an unprecedented 40 days. The Athenian army included a decent but inferior land force compared to the Spartans and a powerful fleet, which was the foundation of Athens' strength. Based on the characteristics of the armed forces, the Athenian strategist Pericles proposed a plan for war with Sparta. The essence of his proposal was to shift the main burden of the war to the sea and operate on the enemy's lines of communication, devastating the coastal areas of Sparta's allies whenever possible. In the event of a Spartan invasion of Athenian territory, the rural population was to be evacuated to the city, where they would wait out the enemy onslaught behind the city walls. The Spartans could not capture Athens. An assault would cost enormous losses, and a siege, given the short duration of Spartan campaigns, made no sense. Athens did not face the threat of hunger or a shortage of other vital products, as everything was delivered uninterruptedly by sea through the port of Piraeus, which formed a single complex with Athens, thanks to the so-called Long Walls. These two walls, 26 kilometers long, connected Athens with Piraeus. Now let's turn directly to the description of the epidemic. So in May 430 BC, the Spartan army invaded the territory of the Athenian state and began devastating the surroundings. In accordance with Pericles' plan, the rural population was evacuated to the city to wait out the attack. Thucydides reports it as follows. The Athenians listened to Pericles and accepted his proposal. They began moving women and children from the fields to the city and transporting other movable property used in farming, even destroying the wooden parts of their houses. Small livestock and pack animals were sent to Euboea and other nearby islands. When they arrived in Athens, there was room for only a few. Some found shelter with friends or relatives. Most refugees settled in the city's vacant lots and temples, except those on the Acropolis. Many settled in fortification towers or anywhere they could find space. The city could not accommodate all the gathered people. Eventually, they occupied even the long walls and a large part of Piraeus. The overcrowding led to unsanitary living conditions. Athens had only a few wells at that time, and the residents of Piraeus had no wells at all, using water collected in cisterns. There was barely enough water for drinking, and none for washing. This caused lice infestations, and there were many rats around people. Unsurprisingly, an epidemic broke out under these conditions. According to Thucydides, the disease began in Ethiopia, above Egypt, modern Sudan. From there, it spread to Egypt, Libya, and much of the Persian Empire. The first cases appeared among the population of Piraeus, and later the disease spread to Athens. Thucydides believed that the residents of Piraeus and then Athens were infected by sailors arriving with cargo from Egypt. Thucydides, who suffered from the illness himself, described the main symptoms of the disease: a sudden, intense fever, without any apparent cause, redness and inflammation of the eyes. The throat and tongue quickly turned bloody red, and breathing became irregular and foul-smelling. The patient began to sneeze and become hoarse, followed by a severe cough. Then came nausea and vomiting, accompanied by intense pain. Most patients suffered from a relentless hiccup that caused severe convulsions. The patient's body was not very hot to the touch, and not pale, but had a reddish-blue hue, and was covered with small pustules and ulcers. Inside, the heat was so intense that patients could not bear even the lightest coverings, and preferred to lie naked, finding it most pleasant to immerse themselves in cold water. Tormented by an unquenchable thirst, unattended patients would throw themselves into wells, and no matter how much they drank, it brought no relief. Death usually occurred from internal heat on the 9th or 7th day. If a patient survived the crisis, the disease moved to the abdomen, causing ulceration of the intestines and severe diarrhea, often leading to death from weakness caused by the diarrhea. The overcrowding resulted in the dying lying on top of each other or collapsing in the streets, half dead from thirst. The temples housing refugees were full of corpses. The extreme contagiousness of the disease meant that the sick died alone, and families that did not abandon their sick members nearly all perished. During burials, no one adhered to prescribed rituals anymore. The dead were simply thrown into common graves. This report by Thucydides was confirmed by modern archaeologists who uncovered a mass grave from that period in the Kerameikos district of Athens. Around 1,000 skeletons were haphazardly piled there. The disease struck people regardless of their piety towards the gods. People felt abandoned by the gods and stopped worshiping them. Facing imminent death, people ceased to observe laws, traditions, and decorum. Neither the fear of the gods nor human laws could restrain people from committing crimes, as they saw everyone dying alike, and thus believed it made no difference whether one honored the gods or not. Moreover, no one was sure they would live long enough to face punishment by law, as a far harsher fate already hung over them. Deeds previously committed only in secret were now done with shameless openness. The sudden changes in people's fortunes were evident to all. The rich died, and those who previously had nothing suddenly possessed all their wealth. Consequently, everyone rushed to sensual pleasures, believing that both life and wealth were equally fleeting. The disease raged in 430 BC, returned in 429 BC, and finally reappeared in the winter of 426 BC. In 429 BC, Pericles, the de facto head of the Athenian state, died from the disease. Researchers estimate that the epidemic killed 25 to 35% of the Athenian state's population, which totaled 250,000 to 300,000 people. The plague inflicted enormous damage on Athens. The morale of the army was significantly weakened, and the death of many citizens greatly reduced Athens's mobilization capabilities. It can be said with full confidence that the plague was one of the major reasons leading to Athens' defeat in the Peloponnesian War and their subsequent decline. Later researchers have attempted to diagnose this disease based on Thucydides' description. However, there is still no consensus, as many different diseases fit his description. One of the first diagnoses was bubonic plague, but this version was soon dismissed. Current medical publications suggest that the Athenian plague could have been measles, smallpox, or typhus. Most researchers, however, lean towards the idea that it was an epidemic of typhoid fever, which seems to be supported by genetic research conducted in the 1990s. There are also some rather exotic theories, in my opinion. Among them is glanders, a disease affecting horses, mules, and donkeys. This theory is supported by the fact that people can indeed contract glanders from animals. Some researchers diagnosed ergotism, a poisoning caused by consuming grain products contaminated with the ergot fungus. This is not an infectious disease, and proponents of this theory explain the deaths of entire families by suggesting that all family members ate the same contaminated food. Some researchers believe it was Ebola fever. In their view, many symptoms of the Athenian plague are characteristic of Ebola. Moreover, Ebola was first recorded in Sudan, the region where the Athenian plague originated. The weak point of this theory is that this disease was first recorded only in 1976, with no previous mentions. I am not a doctor, but a historian, so I cannot advocate for any of these versions. Time and further research will reveal which researchers are correct, and I do not exclude the possibility that the correct diagnosis might currently seem exotic to me. So the story of the Athenian plague of 430-426 BC is concluded. Goodbye.